Yeah, thank you very much. Is this on? No? Yeah? Okay. Didn't sound like that. I was thinking about how to open this speech, and just in the subway I had my practice pad with me. I thought I can combine that with my first quote, because I thought never someone has opened a speech by just playing a kind of drum beat, you know? So, what does that have to do with typography? Space in typography is like time in music. You can divide time as much as possible, but at the end it's important to have a few intervals which you can build upon. So this is a quote from a book that I can recommend to anyone who's interested in typography. So after the talk, if you want to have a look at my Amazon affiliate link, you can have a look at it. So this is like the base that loads of people build their knowledge upon. This is a stock image I found on the internet, and I mean, if you closely look at it, the guy isn't really concerned about body odor problems in his office, but he's rather disgusted by what he's seeing on the screen. You know? So I visited Focus Online just a few days ago, and this is a website that has about 14 million unique users per month. That's data based on November 2014. And if you put an overlay over that, you can see which role typography or the main article plays in this web design. So if you think about typography, we have two different layers which are often used as the same meaning. So we have readability and legibility. If we're talking about how good type can be read, we're actually talking about legibility. How well can I read type? But in this case, we also have the readability layer, which, without even reading the text, tells me I don't want to read this. So readability concerns more the content and how sentences are structured and so on. So in this talk, I'll be talking about legibility, how to achieve good legibility with web typography and with the help of some little helpers in Sass. The good thing is that if you confront a person with a well-set document and you force the person to work with that document, every person feels good about a well-set type. So everybody might not have the vocabulary to describe good type. I mean, you won't see so many guys in a bar discussing how well the logo is kerned. But in this case, everybody has got a feeling for typography. So they can't really tell you if it's good, but they sort of know if it's good. There are three dimensions in typography which basically rule the whole concept about legibility. The first two are line height and font size, and the third one is a thing called measure, which we could translate to width or max width in CSS. Line height and font size is the same attribute name. So what you have to know is that font size, line height, and measure are all values that work together. So if I change the font size, I will have to change my measure, because the text gets larger, and I will also, in most cases, have to decrease my line height just to make sure that I have the harmony. So this you could call the harmony triangle of typography around these three values. So let's talk about font size and line height. Limit yourself at first to a modest set of distinct and related intervals. It's another quote from the book. That means we should all build like a tool set of typography elements that we use. And these intervals, in this case, are meant that we build a typographic scale. For this presentation, I first started off with my body text, which you should always do in typography. Go for the text that is used the most and build upon that. So I chose 24 point, that was in InDesign, as a comfortable size. And based upon that, I calculated each size by 1.618 and divided the whole thing to get the next lower scale. So why 1.618? This is a ratio which you find in nature, which is also considered as the golden ratio. And it's a thing that's perceived as harmonious in many ways. It doesn't always have to fit for each type project which you do. So we're later looking at a gem for Sass which you can use, which is called modular scale. And they all have these defined variables which you can use, which often have a background in music. Yeah, that's where the connection comes from. And based upon your project, you can use these variables or what fits your type best or what's best for what you need. So the two tools we'll be using are modular scale and a part of the Sass framework Compass, which is called vertical rhythm. So if you're already using Compass, you can get going with vertical rhythm right away. And if you know how to install Compass, you also know how to install modular scale. And these two things work really well together. So I won't get too techy here, just to show you a short overview how it's done. First you install Compass, then there's a command to create a new project because you need a configuration file. And afterwards, in your SCSS file, you just import Compass. Or if you don't want to include the whole framework in just this tiny module, which is vertical rhythm, you can use the one in the box with the dashed lines around it. For modular scale, you install the gem, and in your Compass config file, you add a requirement for modular scale, and later on, together with add import Compass, you add import modular scale. So, as I showed you, for this presentation, I chose 24 point as my comfortable body text size. And what you have to do in modular scale is define a MS modular scale base size, which I chose to be 1M. Then you define your ratio, which you want your type to scale up and down. I chose the golden ratio, 1.618 in this case. That's the list I showed you with all of these variables. And in your actual SCSS code, you can then call the function ms0, which means 1m. And if I would type ms1, it would take the next higher level. So it would multiply 1m times 1.618. So ms1 in this case would be 1.618m. And the nice thing about this is that the computer is taking the whole calculation stuff away from me. So because type isn't just about line height and the font size, you also have to think about a thing called the baseline. Because we're all using grid systems, we're all thinking in columns, but not many of us are thinking in columns on the vertical side. So what's pretty easy, I don't know if you can see this, there are lines separating this. What's pretty easy in InDesign, establishing a baseline, is pretty hard on the web. So that's a thing where Compass comes in handy, because Compass regulates all these distances and takes care of the calculation that you always design to a baseline. So with Compass, you have a similar thing, which is called the base font size, which is like MS base from modular scale. And you have your base line height. In this case, 24 pixels is a line height of 1.5. And if I include a established baseline, this makes in, this outputs the HTML that says my line height is 1.5 m because I defined this, and Compass divided 24 pixels by 16 and came up with 1.5. So before having to do all this calculation stuff, which we had to do a few years ago, this program takes care of that. So if for some reason we would have a font size that is 57 pixels because our scale says so, we don't have to calculate the number 1.26316 m as a line height. So you see that the font gets bigger and the line height decreases. And those are things that Compass Vertical Rhythm takes care for you. So you don't have to think about those things. And if we combine those two, this might look like a lot of code, and I swear we'll get away from the code in a second. The only thing we do is define our modular scale base, and afterwards in Compass not name a fixed pixel value, but we'll integrate modular scale into Compass by just calling ms0 for our base font size. And we'll just do the same thing by, in the ideal case, putting all our font variables set to the modular scale. So our biggest size, if we think about the headings from 1 to 6, so our biggest size would be ms6 because it's 6 steps above the base font size, which is ms0. So in this case, this would be 17.9 ems, which is insanely huge. So for this case, the golden ratio, for example, wouldn't make so much sense. If I choose a ratio which is like the minor third, for example, we'd be at a comfortable size. But the differences between each step wouldn't be so big. So what you're looking for is contrast between different type sizes. Now, those weren't all the functions that Compass can do. Here at the top, you can see the link for the reference of Compass. And you can also add Compass to each element on the page. So you're not only thinking about the type, but you're thinking about how do my divs have to be spaced. And each time you add a padding, for example, you have to think about your content moving on the baseline. And those are all things that Compass does for you, that this content always aligns to your baseline. So I can say, I want my paragraph text, for example, my p tag, to have a rhythm margin of 2 lines. And then Compass creates a margin of 2 lines, which are defined by the variables that I gave Compass. So you're only telling Compass how many lines space you want, and it does everything for you. Now, the last point, measure. In responsive web design, we're roughly differentiating between 2 concepts. The first one is fluid layout, which means that your type and your contents just adapt to the website at any given size. And we have adaptive layout. That means we set fixed breakpoints where everything just expands or gets smaller or goes under one another and not next to one another. So in this case, because we want to have full control over our column size, over our measure, we're sticking to adaptive layout for this example. Now, most people consider a character count between 45 and 75 as a comfortable reading measure. The sweet spot for most people is considered as 66 characters. But how do we do this in web design? How can we guarantee that the user gets these 66 pixels if he's watching the whole thing on his 4K display or on a small smartphone? The smartphone is another case. You can't stick to 66 pixels because the type gets too small. You'd rather be going for like 45 characters on a smartphone, but that's a different case. So a simple trick, what you can do, you don't need any JavaScript or advanced CSS techniques for that. This is very light, but I just added a asterisk after 45 characters and one after 75 characters. And then I start resizing my browser window. I have the developer tools open so I can see the width of my screen. And each time these two appear on one line, I know it's time to set a breakpoint that increases my type size, for example, so that I don't go above the 75 character rule. So in this example, I'd say that would be 650 pixels, for example. So I know that in my CSS, I have to bump up the type size by 0.2 em, for example. I'd have to adjust the line height as well, but that's what tools are like Compass are for. So, of course, I can't keep increasing the type size to infinity, because at some point, the type will get really uncomfortable to read for the reader. So we have to really like set a maximum where we consider that type is readable without having to go back from the screen or manually starting to resize the website, which is like the worst case scenario for any web developer. So set yourself a maximum font size, and from that point on, you'll just have to stick with the column. But since web design is going towards very large screens, you can think about other stuff, sidebars, for example, to place left and right on the side to the content. That wasn't serious. I hate sidebars. So digital media is actually taking control away from us designers. You know, in former times, we could just design a poster or a book, and that's the way it came out of the printer. That's the way it was supposed to look, and we could like really live what we love as a designer and be in control over what somebody sees. But the web is not optimal, and in this case, we have to stick to that. The web offers us a lot of suboptimal decisions, and among all these decisions, we have to make the decisions that make the best reading and viewing experience for our user possible. So they're like a few simple things that everybody, and not only designers, can do to improve reading. Because what happens if your JavaScript doesn't load? What happens if your images don't load? The thing that remains on a page is text. I mean, you're dependent that the CSS style sheets load, but text is like the only thing that is really capable of transporting the information we want. The image can be interpreted in many ways. So just a short recap over trying to explain typography or web typography in under 30 minutes. Font size, line height, and measure. Always keep these three in a harmony. If you increase or decrease any of them, the other ones have to change too. Always thrive for readability and legibility before thinking about a fancy type or trying to combine types. If you're not so sure with typography, just look at websites or use the Google Font Combinator and look at common used combinations and stick to that, and just make sure everybody has the best possible reading experience. Never work without a typographic scale. So create your own toolbox of type sizes and just keep using that. It's very comfortable to not think about how big do I have to make this. And I've seen documents where people had 12 pixels and 13 pixels and 11 pixels as the body text. And they're slightly smaller or slightly larger, but they're not really larger or smaller. And this is not really consistent, and what we're thriving for is a consistent experience. Let the computer do the math. And when we're talking about letting a computer do the math, always think about that the numbers mustn't be right. So if Sass gives you some weird number that just doesn't feel right on the screen, like the output isn't like what you thought, but the numbers are correct, don't stick with that and trust your designer gut feeling. So if something feels uncomfortable to read, feel free to adjust that, and don't like stick to the 45 to 75 character rule because you think it must be that way. If it's 80 characters on a page, or if it's 40 characters on a page, it doesn't matter if it feels right. If the type is very narrow, for example, that might be appropriate, or very wide. So those are like the few tools I used. I will give you like the whole presentation and the link list so you can have a look at that. And for articles which, in my opinion, are very good, I'd like to highlight the first one, which is Web-Typography.net. That is basically this book transported to the web, because this is like made for print, more or less. But someone really did the work. It's a few years old, but it still adapts to today, and translated the knowledge from this to the web, and is offering that for free. And I think I'm not over 30 minutes. In that case, write me on @Ferdinand Vogler on Twitter if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'm done. Thank you very much.